Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you love werewolf romance stories full of heartbreak, power, and destiny, make sure you subscribe to Alpha's Wolf Romance Library. Now, let's begin. The stone floors of the ceremonial hall were cold beneath her knees, the rag in her hands damp and rough as she scrubbed at a stubborn stain. The smell of wine and ashes clung to the air, mingling with the sharp bite of polish and candle wax. Her fingers ached, knuckles raw from days spent on her hands and knees. The cracks in her skin burned each time the rag dragged across the marble. Above her, laughter spilled like music. The grand chambers of the upper hall vibrated with the hum of voices, silk skirts sweeping, boots clicking against polished floors. The air carried the scents of perfume, roasted meats, and the faint metallic tang of silver goblets brimming with wine. She could picture them, the noble daughters draped in shimmering gowns, the warriors dressed in finery, their eyes glowing faintly under the blessing of the moon. They were preparing for the ceremony. The night of destiny. The night when mates were chosen beneath the moonlight, bonds sealed by ancient tradition. For them, it was the culmination of years of expectation, of dreams nurtured since childhood. For her, it was just another night with a rag in her hand. She pressed harder at the stain, ignoring the laughter that floated down from above. Each sound stabbed at her ribs, sharp reminders of the life she would never know. She had once dreamed of standing among them, wearing a dress spun with silver threads, her name called before the pack, waiting breathlessly to see who fate would bring her. But those dreams had been stolen long ago, trampled under the weight of her reality. She was nothing more than an orphan, a servant forced into labor by the very pack that mocked her. An omega too weak to fight back, too poor to escape, too invisible to be anything more than the hands that scrubbed their mess. Her back ached as she shifted, the rough fabric of her dress scratching against her skin. It wasn't even her dress, just another cast-off given to her when someone else tired of it. The hem was frayed, patched in places, and smelled faintly of mildew no matter how often she washed it. From above, a voice rang out, sharp and mocking. "Don't miss a spot, girl. The Alpha King himself will walk these halls tonight. Do you want him stepping on your dirt?" Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her head down, her hands moving faster. She had learned long ago that silence was safer than answering. Words only brought more pain, more mockery, more reminders of her place. Her place was here, on the floor, scrubbing while others prepared to shine. Her ears caught the faint strains of music drifting down the stairwell, strings and drums weaving together into something beautiful. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting it wash over her. Just for that heartbeat, she allowed herself to imagine it, her own gown flowing around her ankles, her hair braided with silver ribbons, her name spoken with pride. She imagined stepping into the circle of light, someone reaching for her hand, the warmth of a bond sparking between them. Then the rag slipped from her fingers, and reality returned like ice water down her back. She was not there. She would never be there. Her stomach twisted, a hollow ache gnawing at her chest. She bent lower, scrubbing harder, as though she could erase the ache with each stroke of the rag. Footsteps echoed on the stairwell. Heavy, deliberate. She tensed, not daring to look up. A group of noble girls swept into the corridor, their gowns shimmering like liquid jewels. Their perfume clung to the air, sweet and suffocating. One of them paused, her painted lips curving into a cruel smile as she looked down at the girl kneeling on the floor. "Look at her," she sneered, nudging her friend. "Scrubbing floors while we prepare for the ceremony. Maybe if you scrub hard enough, you'll find a mate hiding in the cracks." The other girls giggled, their laughter sharp as glass. Her chest tightened, but she didn't respond. She pressed the rag harder, her body trembling with the effort to stay silent. Another voice chimed in, dripping with mock pity. "Don't you wish you were us? Don't you wish you could stand beneath the moon tonight instead of crawling in the dirt?" Her throat burned. She kept her head down, refusing to give them the satisfaction of tears. One girl leaned closer, her perfume sickly sweet. "Don't worry," she whispered. "No one would choose you, even if you did stand among us. You'd still be on your knees, just like this." Their laughter rang out again as they swept past, their skirts brushing against her, their heels clicking loudly against the marble. She stayed frozen, her hands trembling, the rag clutched tightly between her fingers. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The ache in her chest swelled, pressing against her ribs until she thought she might shatter. But she didn't. She straightened slowly, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished marble, hair pulled loose from its tie, face smudged with dirt, eyes tired and hollow. She barely recognized herself anymore. The music swelled again from above, the sound of celebration she was never meant to touch. Her throat tightened, her lips parting on a whisper meant for no one. Why was I born like this? But the stone walls didn't answer. They never did. She bent again, rag in hand, and kept scrubbing. Because that was all she was allowed to do. And above her, in the hall filled with laughter and destiny, the Alpha King was about to walk in. And nothing would ever be the same again. She had not always been a servant. There was a time, faint and distant now, when she had known what it felt like to be loved. She remembered flashes of it, her mother's hands brushing her hair back from her forehead, her father's laughter rumbling like distant thunder. Nights spent by the fire with stories told in soft voices, mornings waking to the smell of bread baking in the hearth. They were not wealthy, not powerful, but they were hers. And in their eyes, she was enough. But that life had ended the night the raiders came. She remembered the smell first, smoke choking the air, the sound of fire devouring wood. Then the shouts, the screams, the growls of wolves tearing through their village. Her parents had tried to protect her, shoving her into a crawlspace beneath the floorboards, whispering for her to stay quiet. She had obeyed, trembling in the dark, her small hands clamped over her ears. When the silence came, it was worse than the noise. By the time she crawled out, the house was gone. Her parents were gone. The world she knew was gone. She was only 8 years old. The pack elders had taken her in, not out of kindness, but out of duty. An orphan could not be left to wander, it would bring shame to the pack. But duty was not love, and pity was not care. She was given food, but never warmth. A bed, but never comfort. Work, but never rest. At first, she thought it was temporary. She told herself if she worked hard, if she stayed quiet, if she proved herself useful, maybe someone would take her hand, smile, and tell her she belonged again. But the years passed, and no one did. Her days became endless cycles of chores, scrubbing, hauling, mending, cooking. When others trained, she carried buckets. When others learned, she scrubbed floors. When others laughed, she stayed silent in the corners, her presence barely acknowledged except when someone needed something done. And always, the whispers followed her. She's cursed. That's why her family died. She'll never be more than a servant. No wolf will ever want her. Each word was a stone added to the weight on her back. She tried to fight it, once. At 14, she had begged the elders to let her train, to at least stand among the other young wolves when they practiced under the moonlight. She had argued until her throat was raw, desperate to prove she could be more than the rag in her hand. They had laughed. An omega like you, one elder had scoffed, his voice carrying across the training grounds. You'd last a minute before you broke. Your place is in service. Accept it. And so, she did. Not because she believed them. But because she had no choice. Acceptance became survival. She buried her anger, swallowed her pride, and kept her head down. Each day she worked, each night she collapsed onto her thin mattress, whispering to herself that one day, maybe fate would be kinder. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. The older she grew, the harsher the whispers became. Her beauty was not the polished kind of the noble girls. Her hands were rough from work, her hair never perfectly braided, her dresses patched and worn. She was compared constantly, mocked relentlessly. And as the years passed, hope faded. She learned not to dream of gowns or ceremonies. She learned not to glance too long at the moon, for fear it would remind her of all she had been denied. She learned not to imagine a hand reaching for hers, because imagining it only made the emptiness worse. So when the ceremony nights came each year, she did not watch. She scrubbed. She scrubbed while the others prepared, while the music rose, while the names were called. She told herself she didn't care, that it was easier this way. But deep down, she cared more than anything. Because the truth was, she wanted to be seen. She wanted, just once, for someone to look at her and not see a servant, not see an orphan, not see an omega. She wanted someone to look at her and simply see her. She pressed the rag harder against the floor, the ache in her chest deepening. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished marble, tired eyes, worn skin, a girl who had learned to swallow her own voice. And yet, somewhere in the depths of those tired eyes, a spark still lingered. A spark that whispered she was more than what they called her. More than the role they had shoved her into. More than the rag in her hand. She just didn't know if anyone else would ever see it. The music swelled again from above, a reminder of everything she was not. She closed her eyes, whispering into the emptiness, "Please, just once. Let me be seen." Her voice cracked, barely audible, but the words lingered in the air. And as if the moon itself had heard, fate began to shift. Because that night, the Alpha King was walking into the hall. And he would see her. The sound of drums rolled through the stone corridors, deep and resonant, shaking dust from the rafters. A signal. The ceremony was about to begin. From where she knelt on the cold floor, the girl froze, rag clutched in her raw fingers. The beat echoed in her chest, a cruel reminder that while others ascended to glory, she remained in the shadows. The air shifted as wolves in glittering gowns and polished boots swept past her. They barely glanced her way, their perfume and the swish of their silks washing over her like a tide. She kept her head bowed, eyes fixed on the floor, not daring to lift her gaze. Servants weren't meant to be seen, only to vanish into the background. But even staring at the stone beneath her, she couldn't block out the sight of them entirely. The noble girls glowed, their gowns stitched with silver thread that shimmered beneath the torchlight. Jewels glittered at their throats, their hair braided into intricate crowns that sparkled with pins shaped like crescent moons. They laughed and whispered excitedly, eyes wide with anticipation. This was their night. The night their fates would be sealed beneath the moon's gaze. The night they would stand in the circle, waiting for hands to reach for theirs, waiting for bonds that would shape the rest of their lives. Her throat tightened, her rag slipping slightly from her grip. She remembered being their age, staring up at the moon with wide eyes, believing her future would be just as bright. She remembered pretending, in the quiet safety of her bed, that her name would be called, that someone would reach for her hand. That she would feel the spark of destiny ignite in her chest. But dreams had no place in her life anymore. "Move faster," a sharp voice snapped, dragging her back into the present. A servant supervisor, arms folded, scowled down at her. "The Alpha King will walk these floors tonight. I want them gleaming. If I see one mark, you'll regret it." The girl bowed her head, murmuring, "Yes." The woman sniffed dismissively before sweeping off, her skirt brushing the poor girl's arm like an insult. The girl swallowed, pressing the rag harder into the stone, scrubbing until her hands burned. Above her, the drums grew louder, joined by horns that signaled the start of the procession. Cheers echoed faintly from the upper hall, waves of sound that pressed down on her chest like stones. The grand doors creaked open, and for a moment, she glanced up despite herself. She caught a glimpse of the main hall, vast and breathtaking. The marble floor gleamed like ice beneath the light of chandeliers strung with crystal. Torches blazed against tall pillars, casting warm firelight that mingled with the silver glow of the full moon streaming through arched windows. Banners embroidered with the pack's crest hung proudly from the walls, their colors bold and commanding. At the far end, a raised dais waited, where the Alpha King would stand, his presence binding the ceremony with the authority of the moon. The crowd flooded in, their excitement buzzing like electricity. Names would be called, bonds would be forged, futures decided. And she would not be part of it. Her reflection wavered faintly in the polished stone beneath her, her face pale and tired, strands of hair falling loose across her forehead. For a moment, she hated that reflection, hated that it belonged to her and not to one of the girls above, not to someone who mattered. She bent lower, scrubbing harder, as if she could erase herself from the marble altogether. A group of noble daughters swept into the hall, their laughter sharp as bells. One of them caught sight of her, crouched low with her rag, and smirked. "Look at her," she said loudly, nudging her companion. "Scrubbing floors while we prepare to meet our mates." The others giggled, their voices dripping with cruelty. "Maybe she hopes to scrub her way into someone's heart," another sneered. The laughter echoed through the corridor, sharp and cutting. The girl kept her head down, her hands moving faster, her chest tight. She wanted to vanish, to sink into the marble and never rise again. But their words clung like burrs, burrowing deeper into wounds that had never healed. The drums beat louder, shaking the air. The horns blared again. The ceremony had begun. Her rag slipped from her hand, damp and filthy, landing against her knee. She stared at it for a long moment, her vision blurring. She whispered under her breath, too softly for anyone else to hear, "Why am I always the one on the floor?" But the stone gave no answer. From the grand hall, a cheer erupted, the first name had been called. Applause thundered, music swelled, and the crowd roared its approval. The girl closed her eyes, pressing her forehead briefly against the cold marble. The ache in her chest deepened, hollow and raw. She told herself she didn't care. That she was used to this. That she belonged here, in the shadows. But deep down, a spark of envy twisted inside her. Because she did care. She cared more than she dared admit. And as the ceremony unfolded above her, the laughter, the cheers, the bonds forged under the moon, she remained in the shadows, scrubbing, her body aching, her heart heavy. Unseen. Unwanted. Forgotten. But fate has a cruel way of turning. Because before the night ended, the Alpha King's gaze would fall where no one expected. On her. The ceremony above grew louder, voices blending into a chorus of cheers and music. Each name called was met with applause, laughter, and the spark of bonds forming. The sound was both distant and painfully close, seeping through the cracks of the stone walls until it settled heavy in her chest. She tried to ignore it. She focused on the rag in her hands, on the dull ache in her knees, on the stains that never seemed to disappear no matter how hard she scrubbed. Work was safer than listening. Work was safer than dreaming. But the pack never let her stay invisible for long. "Hey!" a sharp voice barked, cutting through the hum of the hall. She looked up just in time to see a servant girl her age, dressed in cleaner clothes, smirking as she tipped a goblet of red wine onto the floor. The liquid spread in a dark crimson pool, snaking across the polished marble until it touched the girl's knees. "Clean that up," the servant sneered, her eyes glinting with malice. "Can't have the Alpha King stepping in filth." Laughter erupted around them. Other servants, nobles passing by, even a few guards chuckled at the sight of her scrambling to soak the spill with her rag. Her cheeks burned as heat spread through her chest. She pressed the rag into the liquid, her hands trembling, her dress soaking at the knees. Each laugh stabbed into her, twisting the knife of humiliation deeper. Faster, another voice mocked. The Alpha King won't wait for a little maid. The laughter grew louder, sharper. She bent lower, her hair falling into her face, hiding the tears threatening to spill. She had learned to stay silent, to swallow the pain, to endure. But every word cut deeper, every laugh rang louder, until her chest felt hollow, scraped raw from the inside. One noble girl in a gown of emerald silk paused to watch her, lips curving into a cruel smile. She leaned down just enough for her words to sting. "Pathetic," she hissed. "On your knees, where you belong. Don't even dream of standing with us." The crowd around her laughed harder, emboldened by cruelty. Someone nudged her shoulder with their boot as they passed, spilling another drop of wine across the floor. Her hands shook as she scrubbed harder, her tears mixing with the stain she tried desperately to erase. The rag slipped from her grip, soaked and useless, leaving her hands bare against the cold marble. She wanted to disappear. To vanish into the floor and never rise again. But the world would not let her hide. "Look at her," someone called out, voice loud enough to echo through the corridor. "Scrubbing floors while we choose mates. Maybe she thinks the moon will pair her with a broom." The laughter that followed was deafening. Wolves clutched their sides, tears streaming from their eyes, their mockery echoing through the grand hall. Her chest ached so fiercely she thought she might break in two. Her vision blurred, her breath shallow, every instinct screaming at her to run. But where would she run to? She had no place, no power, no one who would stand beside her. Her hand froze against the marble. For just a moment, she wished the floor would open and swallow her whole. And then, the laughter died. It didn't fade slowly, didn't taper off into whispers. It stopped. Abrupt, sharp, like a blade cutting through the air. The girl froze, still on her knees, the rag limp in her hand. She didn't dare look up at first, afraid the silence was only another cruel trick. But the weight in the air shifted, heavy and electric, pressing down on every body in the hall. She lifted her head. And saw him. The Alpha King. He had entered the hall without a word, his presence commanding silence where no one else could. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the firelight and eyes that glowed faintly with the silver light of his wolf, he stood like a storm contained within flesh. Every gaze in the room had turned to him. Every breath seemed to catch in the throats of those who had been laughing only moments before. And his eyes. They were not on the nobles, not on the elders, not even on the grand dais at the far end of the hall. They were on her. The poor girl, kneeling on the floor, rag limp in her hand, wine staining the hem of her patched dress. Her heart stopped. For the first time in her life, someone looked at her, not with mockery, not with disgust, not with pity. The Alpha King's gaze was steady, unflinching, sharp as the edge of a blade. He saw her. Truly saw her. Her chest tightened, a tear slipping free despite her desperate attempt to hold it back. Around them, whispers erupted like wildfire. Why is he looking at her? Does he not see what she is? Impossible. The nobles shifted uncomfortably, their laughter forgotten. The servants who had mocked her moments before now trembled, their faces pale as the weight of his gaze swept over them. The girl's hands shook. She wanted to look away, to drop her gaze back to the floor where she belonged. But she couldn't. Something in his eyes held her in place, pinning her to the moment, as though the moon itself had commanded her not to move. And in that stillness, with the entire hall watching, she realized something that made her breath catch. For the first time in years, she wasn't invisible. The Alpha King had noticed her. And nothing would ever be the same again. The great doors of the ceremonial hall creaked open, the sound booming like thunder across the marble. The crowd turned as one, their whispers dying instantly. A rush of cold air swept in, carrying the scent of pine and steel, a reminder of the world beyond these walls. And then he stepped inside. The Alpha King. He was taller than most men, his shoulders broad beneath a cloak of black trimmed with silver. His dark hair fell in tousled waves, catching the glow of torchlight, and his eyes, his eyes, glimmered like molten gold, faintly glowing with the power of his wolf. Every movement he made carried weight, an unspoken authority that pressed against the air, demanding silence without a single word. The musicians faltered, their strings falling still. Servants bowed their heads instantly. Nobles straightened their backs, plastering smiles on their faces as though eager to prove their worth under his gaze. But no one dared speak. No one dared break the electric hush that rolled through the hall. The girl was still kneeling on the floor, rag limp in her hand, wine staining her dress. Her chest rose and fell sharply, every breath a struggle as she stared at him, unable to look away. She had seen him before, from a distance. Everyone had. The Alpha King was not just a ruler, he was a living legend. Warriors spoke of his battles with awe, elders whispered of his wisdom, and every young woman dreamed of his gaze falling upon her beneath the moonlight. He was power incarnate, wrapped in flesh and shadow. But never had she imagined his gaze would fall on her. And yet, it did. His golden eyes swept across the hall, pausing briefly on the nobles who had gathered closest to the dais. Their smiles stretched wider, their bodies stiff with nerves, as though desperate to catch his notice. But her body refused to obey. She could only watch as he crossed the hall, his gaze never leaving hers. The nobles murmured frantically now, their disbelief rising like a storm. It can't be. He's looking at her. This is madness. One of the servants who had mocked her earlier stumbled forward, forcing a laugh. My king, he said quickly, bowing low, forgive the distraction. She is nothing, a floor girl, a nobody. Allow me to remove. The Alpha King's gaze cut to him, sharp as a blade. The servant froze mid-sentence, his mouth snapping shut. His knees buckled, his body trembling under the sheer weight of that stare. With a whimper, he stumbled back into the crowd, his head bowed so low it nearly touched the marble. The Alpha King returned his gaze to her. She felt her breath hitch again, her chest aching with the effort to hold herself still. Every part of her screamed that this wasn't real, that this couldn't be happening. She was nothing. She was invisible. She was the girl no one wanted. And yet, in that moment, she was the only one he saw. His boots stopped just a few feet away. The wine-stained floor still glistened between them, a cruel reminder of her humiliation. He glanced at it once, then back at her, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he extended his hand. The hall gasped. The girl's eyes widened, her chest tightening as she stared at the hand before her. Strong, steady, commanding. It was an invitation, an order, a lifeline all at once. Her rag slipped from her grasp, falling to the marble with a damp thud. Her fingers trembled, her heart racing, but something deep inside her stirred, something that told her to reach for him. But fear clawed at her chest. What if this was a trick? What if the moment shattered the second she moved? What if the crowd's laughter returned louder than ever? The Alpha King's voice broke the silence. Deep, calm, steady. Stand. The word was simple. But it was laced with a power that left no room for doubt, no room for disobedience. It wasn't just an order. It was a command meant for her and her alone. Her breath trembled as she placed her hand in his. Heat surged through her fingers at the touch, sparks racing up her arm and flooding her chest. Her knees buckled, but his grip was strong, pulling her effortlessly to her feet. The hall erupted in chaos. Gasps, shouts, protests filled the air. Nobles shouted over one another, their voices sharp with disbelief. Elders exchanged frantic glances, their faces pale. The servants who had mocked her moments before cowered at the edges of the room, their eyes wide with fear. But she heard none of it. Her gaze stayed locked on his, her breath shallow, her chest tight. For the first time in her life, she was not kneeling. She was not invisible. She was standing. And it was because the Alpha King had chosen to see her. Her hand trembled in his, the calluses on her palms brushing against his steady grip. For a moment, she thought she would collapse under the sheer weight of it all, the stares, the whispers, the enormity of the Alpha King's presence. But his hand held her firm, anchoring her against the tide of humiliation threatening to drag her under. He did not look at the nobles. He did not look at the elders. He looked only at her. His eyes, molten gold, glowing faintly in the firelight, searched her face with a steadiness that made her chest tighten. It was as though he were peeling away every layer she had been forced to wear, the servant, the Omega, the invisible girl. Until nothing remained but her. Her breath caught. And for the first time, she didn't feel like dirt beneath their boots. She didn't feel like a shadow, or a mistake, or a curse. She felt seen. The hall could not bear it. Someone hissed, disbelief dripping from their tone. The Alpha King cannot mean her. This is an insult to the ceremony. The whispers swelled into murmurs, and the murmurs into shouts. Wolves craned their necks, their jeweled collars flashing in the light as outrage twisted across their faces. One elder struck his staff against the floor, the sound booming. "My king," he said, voice shaking though he tried to mask it with authority, "this girl is a servant. She has no place in this hall, no place in this sacred night." The Alpha King did not glance at him. His golden eyes stayed locked on hers. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, unshakable. "She has a place because I say she does." The hall erupted. Gasps, protests, shouts filled the air. Nobles pressed forward, their outrage spilling over like wine from an upturned goblet. "This is madness," one woman cried, her jeweled hand clutching her chest. "She is nothing but filth," another spat. "To shame the ceremony like this." The Alpha King's wolf stirred, its growl rumbling faintly in the air, felt more than heard. The crowd faltered, their words dying in their throats as the weight of his dominance pressed heavier. But still, disbelief clung stubbornly. The girl's knees wavered. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in her ears. She wanted to shrink away, to hide, to vanish. But his hand held hers, steady, unyielding. "Why?" she whispered, so soft only he could hear. "Why me?" His gaze softened, just slightly. Enough that the world seemed to blur around her. "Because you looked at me," he murmured, and did not look away. Her breath trembled, her lips parting on a gasp. She didn't understand, couldn't understand, what he meant. But the words struck something deep within her, something that had long lain buried beneath years of silence and scorn. The Alpha King turned then, his gaze sweeping the hall, sharp and commanding. The murmurs died instantly, every wolf feeling the weight of his presence. "You see a servant," he said, his voice carrying like thunder. "You see weakness, dirt, nothing." He pulled her gently closer, his hand never leaving hers. "But I see more." The crowd rippled with gasps, outrage flaring once again. "She's beneath us. This cannot stand. The moon would never choose." Silence. The Alpha King's voice cracked across the hall like a whip, silencing them instantly. His wolf's growl surged with it, thick and suffocating, forcing heads to bow despite themselves. Even the elders stiffened, their grips tightening on their staffs as they lowered their eyes. The girl's chest heaved, her heart threatening to burst. Her mind screamed that this was a mistake, that it could not be real, that any moment he would let go and the crowd would tear her apart. But he didn't. He held her hand as though it belonged there. As though she belonged there. Her throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She had dreamed of being seen all her life, but never like this. Never in front of the entire pack, never by the one man who stood above them all. It was too much. Too impossible. Too dangerous. And yet, standing there with his golden eyes locked on hers, she wanted desperately to believe it. The Alpha King leaned closer, his voice meant only for her. Do not bow your head. Not tonight. Her lips trembled. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her chin. Her eyes met his again, and the world seemed to fall away. Around them, the hall seethed. Anger burned in jealous eyes, scorn dripped from snarling lips. The nobles bristled, their pride wounded, their illusions shattered. They could not comprehend it, that he would notice her, choose her, see her. But none of it mattered. Because in that moment, beneath the weight of 100 stares, the Alpha King and the servant girl stood locked together, bound by something no one else could break. Recognition. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The hall was trembling with voices again. The Alpha King still stood with her hand in his, her chin lifted beneath his command, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. But around them, the storm was rising. She's not worthy, a noblewoman cried, her jeweled bracelets jangling as she gestured wildly. This is a disgrace to the moon, another shouted. You dishonor the ceremony, my king, an elder roared, his staff slamming against the marble. The uproar grew, a wave of outrage crashing against the fragile moment that had bloomed between them. Faces twisted with anger, voices dripping with scorn. The servants who had mocked her earlier now stared in horror, trembling at the memory of their cruelty. The girl's breath quickened, her chest tightening as the walls of hostility closed in. She wanted to shrink back, to let go of his hand, to disappear into the floor and escape the venom in their eyes. But his grip was steady, unyielding. His thumb brushed faintly against her knuckles, a silent promise that he would not let her go. The Alpha King's gaze swept the hall, golden eyes blazing. His presence radiated like fire, pressing against every body in the room, demanding silence. But for once, the nobles resisted. One of the elders stepped forward, his silver robes gleaming, his staff raised high. His voice boomed across the hall. My king, you cannot choose her. She is a servant, an orphan with no bloodline, no training, no worth. This ceremony is sacred. You risk the balance of our pack by disgracing it with her presence. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the nobles, their heads nodding, their eyes flashing with self-righteous anger. The girl's throat tightened. Each word cut into her like a blade, reopening wounds she had carried all her life. No bloodline. No worth. Nothing. Her knees buckled slightly, but the Alpha King's hand steadied her, pulling her upright. His voice rang out then, deep and commanding. You speak of bloodlines as if they are everything. You speak of worth as if it is measured in gowns and jewels. But tell me, his gaze burned into the elders. Where were your bloodlines, your worth, when this girl endured humiliation after humiliation, and not one of you stopped it? The elder faltered, his lips parting in shock. The Alpha King's voice rose, filling every corner of the hall. You call her worthless because she scrubs your floors. But she has endured more than any of you. You call her unworthy, yet she has more strength in her silence than you have in your noise. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some nobles turned their faces away, shame flickering across their eyes. Others sneered, their pride refusing to bend. The girl's chest tightened, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. She had never heard anyone speak for her before. Never. Each word was a balm and a blade all at once, healing what had been broken, yet cutting deeper into the fear that this moment could not last. Another noble stepped forward, his face red with fury. My king, this is madness. She is not chosen by the moon. Look at her. She is nothing but dirt. If you raise her, you lower us all. The Alpha King turned his gaze on him, sharp and merciless. You lower yourselves with your cruelty. You disgrace the moon with your arrogance. And you dare speak of madness? His wolf stirred, its growl echoing faintly through the air, pressing down on every soul in the hall. The noble choked on his words, his body trembling, his head bowing against his will. The uproar dimmed for a moment under the weight of his dominance, but it flared again as soon as he eased. She cannot stand beside you. She will ruin the ceremony. The pack will never accept this. The girl's breath came faster now, her heart pounding painfully. The weight of their hatred was crushing, suffocating. Her hand trembled in his, her knees weak. She whispered, barely audible, maybe they're right. The Alpha King turned sharply to her, his golden eyes fierce. No, he said, his voice low but blazing with conviction. They are blind. But I am not. His grip tightened on hers, his presence wrapping around her like armor. Do not bow to them. Not now. Not ever again. Her lips parted, her chest trembling. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to hold on to those words, to let them drown out the venom of the crowd. But years of pain, years of being told she was nothing, clawed at her like chains. The elders raised their staffs together, their voices booming in unison. This cannot be allowed. The torches flickered violently, shadows leaping across the walls as their power crackled in the air. The Alpha King stepped forward, pulling her slightly behind him, his eyes glowing brighter. His wolf surged within him, its growl rising like thunder, shaking the very stone beneath their feet. Enough, he roared, his voice shaking the hall. The uproar silenced instantly. The glow of the elders' staffs dimmed, their hands trembling under the weight of his dominance. Nobles cowered, their heads lowering, their bodies trembling with the instinct to submit. The girl stared at him, wide-eyed, her breath caught in her throat. He stood like a storm, his power unmasked, his presence undeniable. And yet, when his gaze returned to hers, it softened. For years, he said, his voice lower now but carrying still, you made her invisible. Tonight, I will not allow it. She is seen. She is chosen. She stands with me. The hall was silent, stunned into stillness. And in that silence, something shifted. The nobles still bristled, the elders still trembled, but none dared to speak again. Not against him. Not against the Alpha King who had revealed his storm. The girl's lips trembled, tears spilling down her cheeks. She had dreamed of being seen all her life, but never like this. Never by him. Her whisper broke softly into the silence. Why me? His golden eyes held hers, fierce and unyielding. Because when no one else did, he murmured, you saw me. Her breath broke, a sob trembling in her chest. And in that moment, despite the storm raging around them, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. The hall trembled under the weight of silence. The nobles stood frozen, their jeweled gowns and polished boots suddenly meaningless in the face of the storm standing before them. The elders clutched their staffs, their faces pale, their lips trembling with words they dared not speak. Even the torches along the walls flickered wildly, their flames bowing low as if the fire itself knew who stood in command. The Alpha King. He no longer hid behind ceremony or pretense. His wolf surged inside him, golden eyes glowing brighter, his presence filling every inch of the hall like a tide that none could withstand. The poor girl stood at his side, her hands still in his, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. The world had always taught her she was nothing. But here, with his grip anchoring her, she felt as though she was tethered to something unstoppable. And the crowd could not accept it. She's not worthy, one noble spat, his voice shaking. She defiles this sacred night, another cried. This must not be allowed. Their voices broke off all at once as the Alpha King lifted his chin, his eyes blazing. His voice cracked through the hall, low and thunderous. Do you dare tell me who I may choose? The question struck like lightning, sharp and merciless. The nobles recoiled, some stumbling back, their courage shriveling under his gaze. Yet the elder in silver robes, trembling though he was, stepped forward, his staff glowing faintly as he tried to summon authority. My king, he said, his voice thin against the storm, the laws of the ceremony are older than you, older than any throne. The moon chooses. Not you. And surely the moon would not choose her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eyes turned to the Alpha King, waiting, hoping perhaps that he would bend to tradition. But he did not. His lips curved into the faintest, coldest smile. His voice dropped, steady and fierce. The moon did choose. You were simply too blind to see it. He raised the girl's hand higher, the torchlight glinting against her trembling fingers entwined with his. The hall gasped as one, the weight of the moment crashing over them. She is the one I see, he declared. She is the one the moon set before me. While you mocked, while you scorned, while you raised your heads too high to notice, she was here. Silent. Enduring. Stronger than all of you who wear your pride like jewels. His wolf's growl rumbled through the air, vibrating in the walls, rattling the chandeliers above. The nobles faltered, many bowing their heads instinctively, unable to withstand the force of his dominance. Some dropped to their knees, their bodies trembling, their instincts betraying their arrogance. Even the elders stiffened, their staffs dimming as the power of their authority was drowned beneath his presence. The girl's knees nearly buckled, but he held her steady. She could barely breathe, tears spilling freely down her cheeks, her heart caught between disbelief and awe. You call her nothing, the Alpha King thundered, but I tell you this, she has endured more cruelty in her silence than you could in a lifetime of privilege. You call her weak, but it is not weakness to endure when the world is against you. It is strength. His voice cracked through the hall like thunder. And I will not allow her to be unseen again. The words hung in the air, final and undeniable. The crowd was silent now. No laughter. No mockery. Only the weight of his declaration pressing down on them like iron chains. The elders exchanged glances, their lips tight, their eyes flickering with fear. They could not fight this. Not tonight. Not against him. One noble tried to speak, his voice trembling. But, she is a servant, she is. The Alpha King's gaze snapped to him, golden and blazing. The man fell silent instantly, his body shaking as instinct forced his head to bow. The girl gasped softly, her chest tight. For so long she had believed their words, that she was nothing, that she was weak, that she was unworthy. But here he was, standing before them all, his power undeniable, his choice unshakable. And he had chosen her. Her lips trembled as she whispered, so low only he could hear, "Why me?" He turned to her, his golden eyes softening just for her. His voice, low but steady, brushed against her like warmth in the cold. Because when they saw dirt, I saw light. And I will never let that light be dimmed again. Her breath broke, a sob trembling from her chest. The hall erupted again, not in laughter, not in outrage, but in chaos. Nobles shouted over one another, some protesting, some fearful, some begging for clarity. Elders struck their staffs desperately, trying to restore order. But the Alpha King did not waver. He pulled the girl closer to his side, his wolf's dominance rolling outward in waves so fierce that even the strongest warriors in the hall lowered their heads. The crowd was breaking, their arrogance splintering under the truth none of them could deny. The Alpha King had chosen. And the moon itself seemed to bless it, the silver glow streaming through the arched windows falling directly on them, illuminating the servant girl who had been invisible all her life. The poor girl, trembling with disbelief, stood bathed in moonlight beside the Alpha King. And for the first time, she did not feel like nothing. She felt like everything. The hall was silent again, but this silence was different. It was heavy, trembling, filled with awe and fear. Nobles who had mocked only moments ago now stood pale and uncertain. Elders clutched their staffs tighter, their eyes flickering nervously beneath furrowed brows. Servants pressed against the walls, trembling, their gazes darting between the Alpha King and the girl at his side. She stood frozen, her hand still in his, her heart racing so violently she thought it might tear through her ribs. She wanted to speak, to beg him to release her before the pack turned their rage on her. But his grip was steady, strong, as though her trembling was absorbed into his stillness. He turned slowly, sweeping the hall with his golden gaze. When he spoke, his voice carried like thunder. "You all know me," he said, each word sharp and deliberate. "You know my bloodline, my battles, my victories. You praise me when it suits you, bow when it benefits you, and boast of my strength as though it belongs to you. But tonight, your pride is stripped bare. Tonight, you see the truth." He lifted their joined hands higher, the torchlight gleaming against her trembling fingers. His voice deepened, resonant and commanding. "This girl you mocked. This girl you trampled. This girl you forced to her knees while you drank and danced above her, I choose her." Gasps erupted, sharp and horrified. Protests followed, voices rising like a storm. "She is unworthy. You disgrace the pack. The moon cannot bless this." The Alpha King's wolf surged, its growl rumbling through the hall like rolling thunder. The marble floor beneath them trembled faintly, cracks spidering outward as his dominance spilled unrestrained. "Silence," he roared. The protests died instantly. Wolves staggered, some falling to their knees, their heads bowed against the crushing force of his power. Even the elders bent slightly, their staffs dimming as their authority waned. The girl's chest heaved, her breath trembling. She stared at him, wide-eyed, unable to believe what she was hearing. Unable to believe she was the center of this storm. The Alpha King's voice softened, but it carried still, filling every shadow of the hall. "You call her worthless because she has no wealth, no title, no bloodline. But what are titles compared to truth? What is bloodline compared to strength? While you wrapped yourselves in silk and arrogance, she endured humiliation you would not survive. While you drowned in pride, she worked, unseen and unthanked. That is strength greater than any of yours." His eyes swept the crowd, fierce and unyielding. "And you will bow to it. You will bow to her." Gasps rippled through the hall. Nobles recoiled in shock, elders stiffened in outrage, servants clutched at one another in disbelief. The girl's knees buckled slightly, but he pulled her closer, anchoring her against the storm. Her lips parted, her voice breaking on a whisper. I don't understand. Why me?" His golden eyes turned back to her, softer now, his voice lowering so only she could hear. "Because when no one else dared, you looked at me. You saw me. And I will not forget it." Her throat tightened, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. She wanted to speak, to tell him she was nothing, to insist that he was wrong. But the words refused to come. Deep inside her, something cracked, a wall built from years of scorn and silence. And in its place, a fragile spark bloomed. Hope. The Alpha King turned back to the hall, his voice rising again, final and undeniable. "Tonight, before the moon, I declare what you refuse to see. She is mine. My chosen. My equal." The torches flared violently, their flames leaping higher, as if the fire itself bowed to his words. The silver glow of the moon spilled through the tall arched windows, falling directly on them, bathing them both in light. The crowd bowed. It was not voluntary, it was instinct. One by one, heads lowered, knees bent, their bodies forced by the weight of his dominance. Even those who despised it, who whispered curses in their hearts, could not resist. Their wolves betrayed them, submitting to the Alpha King's claim. The girl gasped softly, her body trembling as she looked around. Nobles who had laughed at her hours before now bowed their heads. Servants who had mocked her now pressed their foreheads to the marble she had scrubbed. Even the elders stood bowed, their staffs dim and powerless. Her lips parted in disbelief. They're bowing. The Alpha King looked down at her, his golden eyes steady. His voice was soft, meant only for her. They bow because they must. But one day, they will bow because they choose to. And that day will come because of you. Her breath trembled, tears streaming down her cheeks. She could not speak, could not move, could only stand beside him as the entire hall bent to his will. The Alpha King's voice rose one last time, sealing the moment in eternity. Remember this night. Remember who you scorned. Remember who you mocked. She will never kneel before you again. From this night onward, she stands with me. The hall shook with the force of his declaration. The moonlight brightened, the torches flared, and the pack, every wolf, noble and servant alike, bowed deeper still. The poor girl, once invisible, now stood bathed in light beside the Alpha King. And for the first time in her life, she believed she was more than nothing. She was his. The weight of silence filled the hall once more, but this silence was unlike the others. It was not the silence of mockery. Not the silence of scorn. It was the silence of surrender. Nobles bowed, their jeweled crowns dipping low, their pride crumbling under the Alpha King's storm. Elders bent stiffly, their staffs dim and powerless, their voices stolen by the dominance pressing down on them. Servants knelt, trembling, unable to comprehend how the girl who once scrubbed floors now stood above them all. And in the center of it, she stood at his side. Her hand was still in his, trembling but anchored. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, tears clinging to her lashes. She could barely breathe, could barely comprehend the moment. Hours ago, she had been on her knees scrubbing stains while the world prepared to celebrate above her. Hours ago, she had been invisible, mocked, unwanted. Now, she stood in the light, her hand held by the Alpha King himself. And the world bowed. She felt the tears spill freely, sliding down her cheeks. She whispered, her voice so faint it was nearly swallowed by the silence, "I don't deserve this." The Alpha King turned, his golden eyes softening as they met hers. His voice was low, steady, meant for her alone. You endured when no one else would have. You stood when the world wanted you broken. You deserve more than they can imagine. Her throat tightened, a sob trembling in her chest. She shook her head, but he squeezed her hand gently, grounding her. You are mine, he said, his voice a vow. And I will not let the world take that from you. The torches flickered, the moonlight pouring through the tall arched windows, bathing them in silver glow. It felt as though the heavens themselves bore witness to the vow spoken that night. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to challenge him. The nobles shifted, shame and bitterness clinging to their bowed heads. The servants remained silent, fear and awe mingling in their wide eyes. The Alpha King's voice rose once more, filling the hall. This ceremony is ended. The mate the moon chose for me is here, and I have claimed her. The word struck finality into the room. There would be no arguments, no protests. His dominance left no room for defiance. He turned, pulling her gently to walk beside him. The crowd parted instantly, a living sea bending out of his path, their heads lowered as he passed. Whispers followed them, frantic but hushed. She was nothing. How can this be? The Alpha King chose her. Her legs trembled with each step, but his steady presence at her side carried her forward. She could feel the eyes burning into her back, the weight of envy, of disbelief, of anger. Yet for the first time in her life, she didn't bow under it. She didn't break. Because he walked with her. They passed through the great doors, the heavy wood groaning as it shut behind them. The chaos of the hall was muffled, swallowed by the quiet of the night. The cool air rushed over her, carrying the scent of pine and earth, the night sky stretching vast and endless above them. The moon hung full and bright, silver light spilling across the courtyard like a blessing. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her chest rising and falling, her heart refusing to slow. She turned to him, her lips trembling. "Why me?" she whispered again, her voice breaking. The Alpha King stopped, his gaze holding hers with a steadiness that sent warmth rushing through her chest. His voice was low, softer than she had ever heard it. "Because when the world turned its back, you didn't. You saw me." Her breath caught, her lips parting as her tears fell freely. She couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to respond. But she didn't need to. His eyes said the rest. He reached for her cheek, his touch gentle, calloused fingers brushing away the tears. For the first time in years, she felt safe. The world had mocked her, trampled her, erased her. But he had seen her. He had chosen her. And nothing would ever take that away. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, whispering so faintly it was barely sound. "Thank you." The Alpha King smiled, faint but real. "No. Thank you." The courtyard fell silent, the moon shining down on them as though blessing the bond that had been forged not in finery, not in tradition, but in truth. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible. She felt chosen. This story reminds us that sometimes, the most powerful bonds are not forged in glory or wealth, but in kindness. When the world mocks, when the world rejects, one voice, one hand, can change everything. If you were her, scrubbing floors that night, would you have dared to lift your head when the Alpha King noticed you? Tell me in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me here at Alpha's Wolf Romance Library for more stories that will keep your heart racing until the very end.